April 24, 1946. Yokohama, Japan. The winter wind cuts sharp across the rubble-strewn harbor. A young woman named Takahashi Fumiko stands frozen at the edge of what was once her family's noodle shop, now reduced to charred beams and ash. Her hands tremble, not from cold, but from the low rumble growing louder in the distance. American trucks. Dozens of them. The convoy winds through the broken streets like a mechanical dragon, olive drab and unstoppable. Around her, neighbors retreat into shadows, pulling children close, lowering their eyes. 4 months, they have been told what to expect. The radio broadcasts, the whispered warnings, the government pamphlets distributed in the final desperate weeks of war, all painted the same picture. The Americans would come as conquerors. They would ravage. They would destroy what little remained. And now, here they are. Fumiko's daughter, only 6 years old, clutches her mother's tattered coat and asks in a whisper if the demons have arrived. Fumiko does not answer. She does not know what to say. She only knows the terrible weight of fear pressing down on her chest, the same fear she sees reflected in every face along the shattered avenue. The trucks slow. Boots hit pavement. And then, something happens that no propaganda, no warning, no imperial decree could have prepared them for. An American soldier, tall and broad-shouldered, his rifle slung across his back, approaches an elderly man standing near a collapsed storefront. The old man bows, deeply, instinctively, the way one bows before authority, before power, before the inevitable. It is a bow of surrender, of submission, of resignation to whatever comes next. And the American soldier, this foreign giant in his strange uniform, does not laugh. He does not ignore it. He does not wave it away. He stops. He straightens. And then, carefully, respectfully, he bows back. The street falls silent. Fumiko's breath catches. The old man rises slowly, confusion and disbelief crossing his weathered face. Other soldiers follow the first man's lead. They bow to shopkeepers. They bow to mothers holding infants. They bow to children peeking out from behind makeshift shelters. Each gesture is deliberate, careful, acknowledging something the Japanese people had been told would be trampled underfoot, their humanity, their dignity, their culture. In that instant, in that small act repeated down the length of a devastated boulevard, an entire narrative begins to crack. This moment, multiplied across 1,000 cities and towns throughout occupied Japan, represents one of history's most profound psychological reversals. To understand its weight, one must first understand the architecture of fear that had been constructed in the Japanese mind during the war's final year. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese government knew defeat was inevitable. American bombers had turned 67 cities into ash. The firebombing of Tokyo alone killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had introduced the world to atomic horror. The Imperial Japanese Army, once triumphant across Asia and the Pacific, had been pushed back island by island, each retreat more costly than the last. But admitting defeat was not merely a military decision. It was an ideological catastrophe. The entire structure of wartime Japanese society had been built on the promise of divine protection, on the inevitability of victory, on the sacred duty to fight until the last breath. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast crackled through radios on August 15, 1945, millions of Japanese citizens heard their God Emperor's voice for the first time, and the message shattered them. But what came next was even more terrifying than defeat itself, the unknown nature of the occupation. The government, even in surrender, could not resist one final act of manipulation. In the weeks before American forces arrived, Japanese media intensified a campaign of psychological preparation that bordered on apocalyptic prophecy. Pamphlets distributed by the Interior Ministry warned women to flee to the countryside. Radio broadcasts described American soldiers as savage beasts who would rape, pillage, and murder without restraint. Teachers told students that the Americans would torture them for sport, that their blue eyes could see in the dark like demons, that they ate the flesh of conquered peoples. Local officials in rural prefectures organized mass suicide drills, preparing families to leap from cliffs or drink poison rather than face the coming horror. These were not fringe beliefs. They were official policy, sanctioned terror designed to maintain control even in defeat, to ensure that if Japan must fall, it would fall unified in fear. The historical record shows the depth of this indoctrination. Kazuko Watanabe, a schoolgirl in Osaka, later recalled in an interview archived by the National Diet Library that her teacher instructed the class to sharpen bamboo spears and practice stabbing movements, explaining that when the Americans came, even children would need to kill at least one soldier before dying themselves. In Kagoshima Prefecture, entire villages evacuated to mountain caves, carrying what food they could salvage, prepared to starve rather than encounter the invading force. Police records from September 1945 document hundreds of attempted suicides in the days immediately following the surrender announcement. Families choosing death over dishonor, over violation, over the imagined atrocities to come. The Americans knew about this fear, but they could not fully comprehend its intensity. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, understood that military victory had been achieved, but psychological occupation would be far more complex. His staff prepared for resistance, for guerrilla warfare, for mass civilian casualties as Japanese citizens fought to defend their homeland. Intelligence reports predicted that the occupation would require overwhelming force, that American troops would face ambushes, assassinations, and suicide attacks for years. But MacArthur also understood something else, something that would define his approach to the occupation. He recognized that the Japanese people were not inherently fanatical, but rather had been subjected to a totalitarian system that controlled information, manipulated fear, and weaponized culture. He believed that if American forces could demonstrate an alternative, if they could embody principles of respect, fairness, and humanity, the Japanese people might be able to imagine a different kind of society. It was a gamble, a calculated risk built on the premise that ideology could be countered not with force, but with example. In late August 1945, the first American troops landed at Atsugi Airfield outside Tokyo. They arrived expecting battle. They found silence. The feared resistance did not materialize. Instead, Japanese civilians hid. They watched from windows, from behind walls, from the shadows of destroyed buildings. They waited for the violence to begin. And then, gradually, hesitantly, they began to witness something their propaganda had never prepared them for. Private First Class Robert Whitman, a 22-year-old farm boy from Iowa, remembered his first patrol through a Tokyo suburb in a 1987 oral history interview conducted by the Veterans History Project. He described walking through streets lined with rubble, past families huddled in makeshift shelters, and feeling the weight of countless eyes watching him. An old woman, frail and bent, suddenly appeared in his path. She dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead to the ground, trembling. Whitman didn't know what to do. He had been briefed on Japanese customs, told about the importance of hierarchy and respect, but confronting it in reality was different. He knelt down beside her, gently touched her shoulder, and helped her to her feet. He bowed, mimicking what he had seen in training films. The woman stared at him, tears streaming down her face, and then she bowed back, not in fear this time, but in something approaching wonder. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across Japan in those first weeks. American soldiers, many of them barely out of adolescence, found themselves navigating not a battlefield but a cultural minefield. They had been trained to fight the Japanese military, but now they faced traumatized civilians who expected brutality and instead encountered courtesy. The contrast could not have been more stark. Where Japanese propaganda had promised demons, the civilians found young men who smiled awkwardly, who shared rations with hungry children, who tried, often clumsily, to communicate respect. The bowing became a symbol, a gesture that carried weight far beyond its simple execution. In Japanese culture, the bow is not merely a greeting, it is a language of relationship, of hierarchy, of mutual recognition. The depth of a bow, its duration, its context, all communicate specific meanings. For American soldiers to bow, and to do so seriously rather than mockingly, signaled something profound. It acknowledged that despite military defeat, despite occupation, the Japanese people retained their cultural identity, their dignity, their right to be seen as human beings rather than as conquered subjects. But the bowing was only one element of a larger pattern of behavior that systematically contradicted everything Japanese civilians had been told. American military police maintained strict discipline. Soldiers found guilty of assault or theft faced court-martial. General MacArthur issued explicit orders that the occupation must be conducted with the highest standards of conduct, that any abuse of Japanese civilians would be severely punished. These were not empty declarations. Provost Marshal records from 1945 and 1946 show dozens of American servicemen tried and convicted for offenses against Japanese civilians, with punishments including imprisonment and dishonorable discharge. The Japanese people noticed. In a society that had experienced years of military brutality, both from their own government and from the realities of war, the restraint demonstrated by occupation forces was startling. Women who had fled to the countryside began returning to cities. Families who had hidden in mountain villages ventured back to ruined homes. Children, once terrified, started approaching American soldiers, curious about the strange foreigners who handed out chocolate and chewing gum instead of violence. Michiko Tanaka, interviewed in 1992 for a documentary on the occupation, described her first encounter with American troops in her neighborhood. She was 14 years old, standing with her mother outside the ruins of their home. A group of soldiers approached, and her mother immediately pushed Michiko behind her, prepared to sacrifice herself to protect her daughter. Instead, the soldiers stopped several feet away. One of them, a sergeant with kind eyes, held out a tin of crackers. He smiled. He gestured for them to take it. Michiko's mother hesitated, then bowed. The sergeant bowed back. They accepted the food. As the soldiers walked away, Michiko's mother sank to the ground and wept, not from fear or relief, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that everything they had been told was a lie. The food became another powerful symbol. American rations, canned goods, chocolate bars, powdered milk, Spam, represented abundance in a land of starvation. By the winter of 1945, Japan faced a humanitarian crisis. The war had destroyed agricultural infrastructure, disrupted fishing industries, and left millions without adequate shelter or nutrition. Government rice distributions had collapsed. Black markets flourished. Families sold heirlooms for handfuls of grain. Malnutrition, particularly among children, reached epidemic levels. Into this desperation came the U.S. military with its seemingly inexhaustible supply system. American soldiers, accustomed to 3 meals a day and access to goods that Japanese civilians could hardly imagine, appeared as emissaries from another world. Not a world of military might, which the Japanese understood, but a world of material wealth beyond comprehension. A single American ration kit contained more calories than many Japanese families consumed in a week. The casual generosity with which soldiers shared these rations, handing out candy to children, offering cigarettes to old men, giving canned meat to hungry mothers, reinforced a growing realization. America was not merely militarily superior, it was fundamentally different in its relationship to scarcity and abundance. The supreme commander for the Allied powers, recognizing the immediate crisis, authorized emergency food shipments. By early 1946, American cargo ships began arriving with tons of wheat, corn, and soybeans. The occupation authorities established feeding stations in major cities, providing meals to millions of Japanese civilians. These were not acts of charity alone. They were strategic investments in stability, designed to prevent chaos, disease, and communist insurgency. But to the Japanese people receiving the food, the motivation mattered less than the reality. The Americans, their former enemies, were keeping them alive. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. The Japanese government had spent years teaching its citizens that sacrifice was the highest virtue, that enduring hardship proved loyalty to the emperor, that suffering was noble. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to operate from an entirely different philosophy, one that assumed abundance was normal, that comfort was achievable, that hunger was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. This was not just a difference in resources, it was a difference in worldview. Takashi Nagai, a physician in Nagasaki who survived the atomic bombing, wrote in his diary about treating children at a relief station operated by American military doctors. He described his astonishment not just at the medical supplies, bandages, antibiotics, surgical instruments, but at the attitude of the American personnel. They treated Japanese patients with the same care they would give their own soldiers. They worked long hours without complaint. They smiled. Nagai, trained in Japanese military hospitals where brutality toward patients was common and resources were scarce, found himself reconsidering fundamental assumptions about human nature, about hierarchy, about the relationship between power and compassion. But not everyone welcomed the occupation. Resistance came not from military holdouts, as MacArthur had feared, but from ideological purists who saw American influence as contamination. Right-wing nationalists viewed the occupation as a humiliation that confirmed their worst fears about Western decadence and moral weakness. They interpreted American kindness as manipulation, the food as bribery, the bowing as mockery disguised as respect. Some committed suicide rather than live under foreign rule. Others retreated into silence, nurturing resentment that would simmer for decades. The communists, surprisingly, posed a different kind of challenge. The occupation's democratic reforms, legalization of labor unions, land redistribution, women's suffrage, freedom of speech, created space for communist organizing. The Japanese Communist Party, suppressed during the war, re-emerged and began attracting followers, particularly among urban workers and rural poor. They praised American democracy while simultaneously criticizing American capitalism, creating a complex political environment that frustrated occupation authorities who had expected gratitude, not ideological debate. Yet even among those who opposed the occupation on principle, the daily reality of American conduct created cognitive dissonance. A communist labor organizer might denounce American imperialism in a speech, then accept a ride from an American soldier who stopped to help when his bicycle broke down. A nationalist intellectual might write essays condemning Western corruption, then send his children to schools reorganized along American democratic principles because the education was superior. The gap between ideology and experience, between what people believed and what they witnessed, grew wider with each passing month. The Japanese government, stripped of military power but still functioning as an administrative body under MacArthur's oversight, faced its own reckoning. Officials who had propagated fear now had to explain why the predicted atrocities had not occurred. Teachers who had trained students to hate and fear Americans now had to educate a generation to coexist with them. The newspapers that had printed stories of American savagery now reported on joint reconstruction projects, cultural exchanges, and the gradual normalization of occupation life. Some officials adapted quickly, recognizing that cooperation with the occupation offered opportunities for rebuilding influence. Others struggled with shame and confusion, unable to reconcile their propaganda with reality. Still others simply vanished, retreating from public life, unable to face the judgment of a population that was beginning to understand how thoroughly they had been deceived. By the spring of 1946, transformation was visible everywhere. In Tokyo, American engineers worked alongside Japanese laborers to repair electrical systems. In Osaka, occupation authorities established libraries stocked with American books, newspapers, and magazines, previously banned materials that suddenly flooded an information-starved society. In Kyoto, American soldiers attended tea ceremonies, visited temples, and tried, with varying degrees of success, to understand the culture they were temporarily governing. Children adapted fastest. Within months, kids who had hidden from American patrols were running alongside jeeps, shouting, "Hello! Hello!" in newly learned English, begging for chocolate and chewing gum. They invented games mimicking American baseball, which occupation authorities promoted as a wholesome alternative to martial training. They learned American songs taught by soldiers who organized informal music sessions in parks and playgrounds. They absorbed, with the cultural flexibility of youth, the possibility that the world contained more than one way of being. Adults adapted more slowly, more cautiously, but they too began to change. Women who had expected assault instead found themselves offered jobs at occupation offices, earning wages that allowed them to support families. Men who had anticipated enslavement instead received training in new trades, learned democratic principles in civic education classes, and discovered that the occupation authorities, whatever their flaws, operated under rules that applied equally to occupier and occupied. The bowing continued. It became a ritual of daily life, a small bridge across the vast cultural divide. American soldiers, initially awkward, learned to bow with more precision, more understanding of context and meaning. Japanese civilians, initially stunned by the gesture, came to expect it, to appreciate it as genuine rather than performative. In this repeated exchange, a lowering of heads, a recognition of shared humanity, something subtle but powerful took root. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Keene, who served as an intelligence officer during the occupation and later became a renowned scholar of Japanese literature, reflected in his memoir on the significance of these gestures. He wrote that the bow represented more than courtesy. It represented an acknowledgement that victory did not erase cultural difference, that military power did not grant the right to cultural supremacy, that America could be strong without being cruel, dominant without being destructive. It was, he argued, the occupation's most successful propaganda, precisely because it was not propaganda at all. It was behavior that spoke louder than any broadcast or pamphlet could. The symbolism extended beyond food and gestures to the very structure of the occupation itself. MacArthur, despite his autocratic tendencies and theatrical personality, chose to rule through the existing Japanese government rather than dismantling it entirely. He kept Emperor Hirohito on the throne, though stripped of divine status. He worked with Japanese bureaucrats to implement reforms rather than imposing them through direct military administration. This approach, controversial among some American officials who favored harsher measures, allowed Japanese society to transform while maintaining continuity, to accept change without feeling utterly erased. The new constitution, drafted primarily by American lawyers but presented as a Japanese document, abolished war-making as a national right, guaranteed fundamental human rights, established women's equality, and created democratic institutions. It was, in many ways, more progressive than the American Constitution itself. And it was accepted, not because the Japanese people had no choice, though they didn't, but because the alternative, the system that had led them into catastrophic war, had so thoroughly discredited itself. The land reform program, which redistributed agricultural holdings from large landlords to tenant farmers, transformed rural Japan more thoroughly than any previous policy in centuries. The Zaibatsu dissolution, which broke up the massive industrial conglomerates that had fueled Japanese militarism, reshaped the economic landscape. The education reforms, which eliminated militaristic indoctrination and introduced democratic values, aimed to prevent future generations from repeating their parents' mistakes. These were radical changes, implemented in a matter of years, in a society that had previously changed very slowly. And through it all, the American soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them rotating through occupation duty, continued their daily interactions with Japanese civilians. They dated Japanese women, despite regulations discouraging fraternization. They played with Japanese children. They learned Japanese words and customs. They attended festivals, visited homes, and formed friendships that defied the recent history of brutal warfare. Some married Japanese women and brought them back to America, creating families that embodied reconciliation. Others maintained correspondence for decades with Japanese friends they had made during occupation duty. Not all interactions were positive. There were assaults. There were thefts. There were cases of American soldiers abusing their power, treating Japanese civilians with contempt rather than respect. The occupation was not perfect, not utopian, not free from the ugliness that emerges when one people has power over another. But the overall pattern, the dominant reality experienced by millions of Japanese civilians, was not what they had been told to expect. And that difference mattered. Fumiko Takahashi, the woman who stood frozen in fear on that January day in Yokohama, survived the occupation and lived into her 90s. In a 2002 interview conducted by researchers documenting civilian experiences, she recalled that first moment when the American soldier bowed. She described how her entire understanding of the world shifted in that instant, how the fear that had gripped her since the surrender announcement began, slowly, to release its hold. She rebuilt her noodle shop. She served American soldiers alongside Japanese customers. She watched her daughter grow up in a Japan that bore little resemblance to the one she had known. She remembered, she said, the taste of the first American chocolate she ever tried, sweet, rich, overwhelmingly abundant. It had been given to her daughter by a soldier from somewhere called Texas, who had knelt down to hand it over, who had smiled and said something in English neither of them understood, who had bowed before walking away. That chocolate, she said, represented everything her government had told her did not exist: generosity from strangers, abundance without hoarding, power exercised without cruelty. But more than the chocolate, more than the food shipments, more than the rebuilding programs and democratic reforms, she remembered the bowing. She remembered how it felt to be recognized as human by those she had been taught were inhuman. She remembered the cognitive rupture of experiencing respect from those she had been told would show only contempt. And she remembered how that rupture spread, person by person, family by family, until an entire society had to reconsider everything it had believed about itself and the world. The occupation lasted until 1952, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty restored Japanese sovereignty. By then, Japan had transformed from a militaristic empire to a democratic nation, from an enemy to an ally, from devastation to the beginnings of what would become an economic miracle. The American presence left deep marks, cultural, political, economic, some welcomed, some resented, all permanent. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. A generation of Japanese people learned that their government had lied to them, that the enemy they had been taught to hate was capable of unexpected humanity, that power could be exercised with restraint, that abundance was possible, that change was survivable. They learned that cultural identity could coexist with democratic principles, that tradition and modernity were not mutually exclusive, that defeat was not the end of national existence but potentially the beginning of something better. The children who ran after American Jeeps begging for chocolate grew up to build Toyota and Sony. The women who received their first vote during the occupation became activists who shaped Japanese civil society. The men who learned democratic principles in occupation-sponsored classes became politicians, educators, and business leaders who rebuilt their nation. They did not become American. They became a new kind of Japanese, shaped by trauma and transformation, by the rupture between expectation and experience, by the strange gift of an occupation that bowed. Winter sunlight slants across the memorial in Yokohama's harbor, where tourists photograph monuments and children chase pigeons across smooth stones. The ruins are long gone, replaced by gleaming towers and efficient transit systems. The fear has faded into history, preserved in archives and elderly memories but no longer a living presence. Yet something of that moment persists, the moment when terror met courtesy, when propaganda encountered reality, when the expected cruelty gave way to unexpected respect. The bow, that simple gesture repeated millions of times across a defeated nation, became more than a greeting. It became a symbol of possibility, of the idea that enemies need not remain enemies forever, that violence need not beget violence eternally, that power can choose restraint, that abundance can be shared, that respect can bridge even the widest cultural chasms. It demonstrated that ideology, however deeply ingrained, can be challenged not through force but through example, not through conquest but through conduct. In the end, the Japanese civilians who stood terrified before American troops, who expected demons and encountered soldiers who bowed back, learned something their government had tried desperately to hide from them: that freedom, democracy, and human dignity were not uniquely Western concepts to be feared and rejected, but universal aspirations that could be expressed in Japanese ways, through Japanese culture, by Japanese people. The terror dissolved not because they were forced to forget it, but because reality contradicted it so thoroughly that belief became impossible. The bow continues. In modern Japan, when elders tell stories of the occupation, when historians analyze those transformative years, when descendants try to understand how their grandparents survived and rebuilt, the image resurfaces: the American soldier bowing to the old man, the gesture of respect that signaled something more than military victory. It signaled the possibility of a different kind of power, a different kind of peace, a different future than anyone had imagined possible in those dark days of defeat and terror. That possibility, planted in fear and watered by unexpected kindness, grew into something neither American occupiers nor Japanese civilians fully anticipated: not Americanization, not erasure of Japanese culture, but transformation, adaptation, a hybrid future that honored the past while embracing change. And it began with a bow, returned with sincerity, offered in respect, received in wonder, repeated until fear became memory and memory became history and history became the foundation of something new. The wind still cuts sharp across Yokohama harbor in winter. But no one stands frozen in terror anymore. The demons never came. The soldiers bowed. And everything changed.